A man's downfall rarely begins with failure. It begins with a kiss he thought would save him. Masculine realism. Have you ever wondered when exactly a man begins to disappear? Not in body, but in soul. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins quietly, invisibly, the first time he hears her voice and thinks, maybe this is it. The first time he looks into her eyes and sees not her but the future he always hoped for. The dream, the warmth, the peace. It starts with hope, and hope is always the most beautiful lie. He stops chasing what once burned inside him, not out of defeat, but out of belief. He believes she'll complete him, that love will save him, that happiness will finally have a face. And slowly, one compromise at a time, he trades clarity for comfort, solitude for security, and truth for tenderness. By the time he realizes it, he's already rewritten himself to fit into her world. But what happened to his world? That's the question no one warned him to ask. A man can only be himself when he is alone. But the moment he falls in love, something begins to change, not always visibly, not immediately, but deeply. Love for many men begins as recognition. She looks at him with soft eyes, and for the first time he feels seen, or at least he thinks he does. But what he doesn't realize is that he's not being seen for who he is. He's being seen for who he could become, an ideal, a projection, a blank canvas upon which someone else will paint their dream. And he allows it, gladly, because the hunger to be loved, to be chosen, blinds him to the quiet erosion of his identity. In those first moments of intimacy, he begins the slow process of self-betrayal. He adjusts, he softens, he silences parts of himself that once defined him, not out of weakness, but out of devotion. And that's the tragedy. He doesn't lose himself through conflict, but through compromise. Through the illusion that love is safe, that connection is sacred. But in the mirror of her desire, he sees a version of himself that is no longer his. And by the time he notices, he's not the man he once was. He's someone else, someone shaped not by purpose, but by promise. What if everything you believed about love was a lie? Not a malicious one, but one woven so deeply into your childhood, your culture, your dreams, that you never thought to question it. From fairy tales to films, from songs to sermons, you were taught that love was the highest good, that to find someone who completes you was the goal, that romance was the answer. But Schopenhauer saw what most men never dare admit: love, as we're taught to see, it is not sacred. It's seductive, a biological trap dressed in the language of eternity. He dismantled the myth. To him, what we call romantic love is not divine, it's nature's strategy, an illusion crafted by instinct to manipulate your mind. It whispers fantasies not because it wants your happiness, but because it wants your compliance. It doesn't care about your peace, your dreams, or your calling. It wants only one thing: continuation of the species. And what's more cruel, it feels real. It feels holy. But underneath it is programmed primal and blind. The woman you idolize becomes the gatekeeper of your sacrifice. And the emotion you trust most becomes the very thing that leads you furthest from yourself. We speak of intimacy as if it's the meeting of souls, something sacred, spiritual, even divine. But what if what we call connection is nothing more than biology wearing a beautiful disguise? Schopenhauer pulled back the curtain on this illusion. To him, intimacy was not the merging of two beings, it was nature's sleight of hand. A dance choreographed by the unconscious will, to live designed not to unite souls, but to ensure survival. That moment you felt closest to her, that breathless silence, that aching pull toward her body, her presence, it wasn't destiny. It was instinct. A program running quietly beneath your awareness, convincing you that this moment meant everything, that it was sacred, that it was yours. But it wasn't. It was nature's voice whispering, reproduce, continue. And because that voice is older than civilization, older than words, it speaks in feelings, in longing, in illusion. You think you're in love, but your body is chasing its purpose. And she is responding not from malice, but from her own programming. What the world calls intimacy, Schopenhauer called deception. And the tragedy is, it feels the most real right when it's least conscious. You don't realize it's biology until after it's too late, after you've built your life on what you thought was love. At the core of Schopenhauer's philosophy lies a provocative truth. The difference between man and woman is not merely physical, it is metaphysical. It is a divide that reaches far beyond biology, shaping how each views the world, values life, and defines meaning itself. Man, he argued, is drawn toward the abstract, toward ideas, visions, philosophies, and distant ideals. His soul reaches upward and outward, chasing the invisible forces that move history, art, truth, innovation, transcendence. He dreams not just of survival, but of legacy. He builds for tomorrow. He dies for causes. He longs to shape the future. But woman in Schopenhauer's eyes is tethered to the now, to what is close, tangible, and secure. She cleaves to the present moment not out of flaw, but out of nature. She sees what is needed, what is immediate, what protects and sustains life. Not what could be, but what is. He said women remain children their entire lives, not to demean them, but to highlight this difference in orientation. She perceives through feeling, through closeness, through practicality. And herein lies the misunderstanding. When a man loves a woman, he assumes she sees the world as he does through dreams and ideals. But she doesn't. And when he expects her to walk alongside him toward the infinite, he is often met with resistance, not because she is small, but because he has mistaken survival for transcendence. What is beauty really? To the poet, it is divine. To the romantic, it is fate. But to Schopenhauer, beauty is not a blessing, it is bait. It is nature's most powerful deception, crafted not for truth, but for influence. A woman's beauty, he argued, is not a gift bestowed upon the world, but a biological mechanism designed to seduce, to disarm, and to draw a man away from his path. And it works. Time and again, men of vision, men who built empires, wrote philosophy, discovered the laws of nature, have fallen, not to the sword, not to their enemies, but to the curve of a smile, the softness of a touch, the illusion of connection. In those moments, reason is replaced with longing. Mission dissolves into need. And the fire that once burned for greatness is redirected toward devotion. But this is no condemnation of women. Schopenhauer did not blame them for their beauty. He saw them as unconscious agents of nature embodying its cunning. Their allure is not malicious. It is strategic. And the tragedy is not in their power, it is in man's blindness to it. He does not see that the very thing he worships is the chain he willingly wraps around his own mind. History does not always remember the quiet defeats, the ones that happen not on battlefields, but in bedrooms. It praises the conquests of kings, the victories of warriors, the genius of inventors. But beneath the surface of greatness lies a recurring tragedy, men of immense power brought to their knees, not by their enemies, but by the women they loved. Schopenhauer saw this not as coincidence, but as consequence. He believed that the most dangerous threat to a man's greatness was not war, nor hardship, nor failure, but illusion, the illusion of romance. The belief that love would elevate him, complete him, soothe the chaos of the world. And so he gives in. He lets down his guard. He opens his soul, not realizing that he is surrendering the very fire that made him exceptional. From emperors who rewrote the world to artists who reshaped culture, time has shown us the same pattern. The moment of downfall often begins with a kiss, a promise, a gaze that made him forget his path. Not because she was evil, but because he stopped seeing clearly. He began living for her instead of for his mission. And in doing so, he sacrificed the very part of himself that the world once admired, his undivided purpose. Power does not always announce itself. It doesn't always roar or demand obedience. Sometimes it whispers. And according to Schopenhauer, this is the kind of power women have mastered, not the overt domination of force, but the quiet persuasion of feeling, suggestion, and presence. Where men are taught to lead through logic, strength, and structure, women have evolved consciously or not to rule the invisible. Their influence doesn't confront, it curves. It doesn't threaten, it invites. And it is precisely this softness that makes it so effective. A man may resist commands, but he rarely resists affection. He won't surrender to pressure, but he will kneel for love. And so the battlefield shifts from war rooms and offices to living rooms and bedrooms. Schopenhauer observed that while men build civilizations, women shape the builders, not by competing with them, but by molding their desires. They don't take the throne, they shape the king. And that kind of power is harder to see and harder to resist, because it feels like love, it feels like care. But underneath it is nature's strategy at work, guiding, influencing, pulling strings not out of malice, but instinct. And men unaware often hand over the reins without realizing they've ever let go. We speak of love in poetry, in vows, in sacred tones, as if it were the highest human achievement, the union of two souls destined to complete each other. But Schopenhauer dared to call it what few men have the courage to confront: a transaction, not a transcendence. Not a miracle, but a mechanism. He stripped away the romantic language and exposed what lies beneath an ancient biological strategy disguised in sentiment. To him, what society reveres as love is not spiritual connection, but evolutionary compulsion, a force created not to elevate you, but to use you. It doesn't care for your growth, your peace of mind, or your deeper self. It only cares that the species survives. And to achieve that, it sells you the fantasy of forever, wraps instinct in the costume of destiny, and convinces you that sacrifice is sacred. Men enter love thinking they're stepping into something holy, but what they often find is obligation, expectation, erosion. They give more than they know, hoping to be chosen, loved, kept. But behind the flowers and promises is something older, colder, and deeply unconscious: the need to secure resources, protection, and future offspring. What we call love may only be nature's most beautiful lie. If you strip away the poetry, the rituals, the grand declarations of love, what remains? According to Schopenhauer, what remains is biology, a force indifferent to your happiness, your dreams, your peace. Love, he claimed, is not what it appears to be. It is not the collision of two souls or the intertwining of destinies. It is the will to life, blind, relentless, and purely reproductive. You believe you're falling in love, but what's really happening is a silent orchestration of nature's deepest instinct: continue the species. And nature doesn't care about your career, your spiritual path, or the fire in your soul. It only asks, will you pass on your genes? To fulfill this aim, nature crafts an illusion so powerful that it feels divine. It whispers, fantasies, paints her face in your dreams, convinces you she's different, that this time it's real. But all of it, the butterflies, the obsession, the longing, serves a single agenda: reproduction. Men mistake this compulsion for meaning. They marry sacrifice and surrender, believing they've found fulfillment. But often what they've actually done is submit to a program that never had their peace in mind. Love for many men becomes the reason they forget themselves, and biology is the architect behind the curtain. Marriage, the so-called pinnacle of love, is where the illusion reaches its final, most binding form. To the world, it's a sacred bond, a celebration of commitment, a promise sealed in ceremony. But to Schopenhauer, it was something far less romantic. He saw it as the final trap, a legally sanctioned surrender, a contract not of souls, but of survival. A man doesn't just say "I do." To love, he unknowingly signs away the very freedom that once defined him. He enters with hope. He believes he's found someone to walk beside him, to nurture his purpose, to build a shared dream. But slowly, silently, the dream shifts. The mission becomes maintenance. The passion turns to routine. And what once felt like fulfillment now feels like fatigue. Schopenhauer argued that marriage isn't about love, it's about reproduction. It's nature's mechanism to secure stability for the woman and offspring. The man becomes the provider, the protector, the beast of burden. He works not for vision but for obligation. He sacrifices not for glory but for structure. And when the illusion fades, when beauty wilts and romance dulls, he's left with bills, duties, and a gnawing silence that asks, "What happened to me?" That's not bitterness. That's biology in disguise. What happens when the spell wears off? When the beauty that once captivated begins to fade? When the laughter turns to silence? When the fire becomes a flicker? What remains? Schopenhauer saw what most men only recognize. Too late, that passion is not permanent, and love built on illusion will always decay into disillusionment. What began as worship turns into withdrawal. The woman who once seemed like salvation becomes a stranger, not because she changed, but because the fantasy is no longer sustainable. In place of romance comes routine. The home once filled with warmth and promise now feels like a cage lined with unspoken resentment. He doesn't say it aloud, but deep within a quiet ache grows the ache of a man who traded his purpose for peace and found neither. He goes to work, he pays the bills, he smiles in photographs. Yet somewhere in that silence is the question he no longer dares to ask. Who am I now? Resentment doesn't erupt. It accumulates in the small compromises, in the lost hours, in the parts of himself he buried for the sake of keeping the peace. And the tragedy is not just that love faded, it's that in the process he did too. Schopenhauer never called women the enemy. His critique was not rooted in hatred, but in clarity, a cold, cutting awareness of nature's hidden design. He didn't accuse women of evil. He simply saw them as unconscious agents of something older and more primal, biology's will to survive. Women, he believed, do not act with malice, they act with instinct. And that instinct, honed over millennia, seeks security, stability, and the assurance of future survival. To achieve this, women have developed not physical strength or dominance, but emotional intelligence, the power of subtle influence, of intuition, of silent persuasion. These traits are not calculated strategies. They are deeply embedded in the feminine psyche, passed down through generations of survival. The tragedy is not that women are manipulative, it's that men are unaware. They walk into love thinking it's a partnership of equals, a shared vision of truth. But in reality, they are stepping into a dynamic governed by instincts they were never taught to see. She is not trying to break him, she is trying to secure herself. And in that pursuit, she may redirect his fire, reshape his mind, and tether his soul, not because she wishes to harm him, but because nature demands she protect her future. It's not personal, it's programmed. Most men enter love with noble intentions. They bring honesty, logic, effort, and sacrifice the tools they were taught to value. But in doing so, they often find themselves playing the wrong game on the wrong field, governed by rules they don't understand. Schopenhauer recognized this fatal mismatch. He saw that men engage with women using the language of reason in a realm ruled by instinct, and that is why they lose. Men bring clarity where nature demands emotional nuance. They speak plainly where she listens to tone. They offer stability while she searches for feeling. He tries to win her through provision, honor, and integrity, unaware that these things, while noble, are not the currency of power in the emotional domain. And so he fights with logic where nature never intended a battle of minds. He compromises thinking it's maturity. He surrenders thinking it's love. But every concession pulls him further from his core. Slowly, he gives up his vision, his solitude, his spark, until he is no longer a sovereign man, but a shape molded to fit someone else's need. Not because he is weak, but because he misunderstood the game. He entered seeking truth, but found instinct. He played for love, but was outmaneuvered by biology. And worst of all, he never even realized it was happening. It never happens all at once. The erosion of a man's soul is a gradual, almost invisible process, one small compromise at a time. He doesn't feel the loss when he skips one night of solitude to stay available. He doesn't see the cost when he reshapes his opinions to avoid conflict. But slowly, piece by piece, the man who once burned with purpose begins to dim. Schopenhauer observed that the tragedy of men in love isn't just in what they give, it's in what they abandon. The time once given to building, the silence once used for thinking, the fire once devoted to craft, all of it slowly redirected. At first it feels like love, then like sacrifice. Eventually, it feels like maintenance, a life spent keeping the peace, avoiding tension, preserving something that no longer reflects him. And the world applauds this decay. It calls it maturity. It labels it responsibility. But beneath the surface, many men feel the subtle ache of something lost, a voice they no longer hear, a mission they've forgotten, a hunger they've learned to silence. He smiles in photos. He shows up for birthdays. But inside, he is kneeling not in devotion but in resignation. Not because he failed, but because he forgot who he was. Detachment is often misunderstood. The world sees it as coldness, as withdrawal, as a lack of love. But Schopenhauer saw it differently. To him, detachment was not the absence of emotion, it was the birth of awareness. It was the moment a man steps back far enough from his desires to see them clearly, without illusion, without intoxication. And only from that place can he truly begin to awaken. This isn't a rejection of love. It's the refusal to be ruled by it. It's the conscious decision to love without losing yourself, to care without collapsing, to remain rooted in your purpose even when the storm of longing rages around you. Because a man who is not anchored in truth will always be swept away by fantasy. Schopenhauer believed that true freedom begins not when a man finds someone, but when he no longer needs to. When he is enough in silence, in solitude, in thought. When he no longer searches for completion in the eyes of another, but instead reclaims the parts of himself he once gave away. This is not bitterness. It is clarity. It is the man stepping out of the dream and into reality. It is the first breath of his soul returning home. And from that place he does not become less loving, he becomes more whole. There is a kind of power that cannot be taken, only reclaimed, and it lives in silence. Not the silence of absence or withdrawal, but the inner stillness of a man who no longer seeks permission to be himself. Schopenhauer believed that this stillness, this quiet sovereignty, was the birthplace of true masculine power. Not the kind that dominates others, but the kind that defies illusion. When a man detaches from the noise, the applause, the seduction, the external validation, something extraordinary happens. He begins to hear his own voice again. The voice that existed before the world told him who he should be. The voice that once dreamed freely, loved boldly, and walked alone without fear. It's not that he stops loving, it's that he stops loving blindly. In stillness, he rediscovers his mission. In solitude, he reconnects with his mind, his craft, his truth. And from that centered place, he is no longer controlled by the highs and lows of emotional dependency. He becomes unshakable, not because he is numb, but because he sees. The man who has reclaimed his inner stillness cannot be manipulated. He does not chase. He does not kneel. He remembers who he is, and that remembrance is freedom. Not every man is meant to walk the path of the philosopher. It is not a path of applause, nor comfort, nor companionship. It is the path of the few, those who are willing to trade validation for vision and pleasure for truth. Schopenhauer didn't write for the masses. He wrote for the man who has suffered enough to stop lying to himself. The man who no longer finds peace in illusions, and who is finally brave enough to see the game for what it is and choose not to play. This man is not heartless. He has simply been broken open and rebuilt by clarity. He has loved, and he has lost not just a person, but pieces of himself. He's tasted dependency. He's felt the slow suffocation of living someone else's dream. And now he chooses a different fate. Not isolation, but sovereignty. Not bitterness, but awakening. The highest form of man, Schopenhauer believed, is not the lover or the warrior, but the thinker. The one who can sit alone in stillness and feel no hunger for approval, no ache for something more. Because he has found something deeper than love, he has found truth. And once a man sees truth, he can never unsee it, nor can he ever again be ruled. In a world that romanticizes love and equates self-worth with being chosen, the most important lesson a man can learn is this: never trade your identity for affection. What feels like connection may sometimes be dependency. What looks like love may be instinct in disguise. Schopenhauer's warning isn't about rejecting women or relationships. It's about understanding their deeper nature so that you don't lose yourself in the process. The call is not to withdraw from life, but to wake up within it, to love with eyes open, to build with clarity, to ask yourself hard questions. Am I living my truth or playing a role to be accepted? The man who anchors his soul in solitude, who can sit with himself without craving distraction, is unshakable. Because true freedom doesn't come from being loved. It comes from being whole. And in a culture that tells you to seek happiness in others, the rarest strength is to find peace in yourself.